Good evening. This is Bob Tygenhof. I'm the director of the Center for Active Lifestyle Medicine at the Integrative Medical Group of Irvine in California, Southern California. This is the latest edition of our talk, series in learning how to be safe in an unsafe world. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the consequences of toxin exposures. So for the last 10 presentations, we've been talking about where all these toxic exposures come from and some of the disease conditions and states that they can cause. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about, on the cellular level, what's going on, how are they doing all of these things that they do. And then we'll talk again a little bit more about what actions you can take in order to reduce your exposure and live a little bit safer in what has unfortunately become a relatively unsafe world. We will be concluding this series on Thursday at 8:30 in the morning, and the discussion there will be whether or not living with houseplants makes a difference. And there we're going to take a little bit more of an uplifting type of approach and see what all things you can do in order to make your life both more enjoyable, more livable, and a little bit safer in the long run. So tonight we're going to be talking about basically chemical exposures, what it does to the body on a cellular level, and again, what you can do to protect yourself and be safe within that framework. First thing to realize is that the human body consists of somewhere between 20 and 40 trillion cells. Now that's trillion with a T, not a V, not an M. It's a very, very big number. Within that, those 20 to 40 trillion cells, while every one of them is alive, not a single one of them is conscious. So there is no master cell. There is no place you can point to and say, aha, this is where all the thought comes from. This is the master director of all of the activity that takes place. In fact, every one of those cells operates as a more or less independent little biochemical factory. And it produces what its DNA tells it to produce. But in order for it to do that, it needs to receive information from the outside world. And so every one of these cells has little antennas that stick up from the surface, and basically they are there to receive information from the outside world telling it what to do. Now, all of these cells operate in concert to keep you alive. They do that because you live in an environment that changes, and consequently the requirements for survival change over time. Sometimes it gets hotter, sometimes it gets cooler, sometimes it gets very, very wet, sometimes it gets very, very dry. Sometimes there is a lot of food that's available. Other times there's virtually nothing, and you have to go for days, weeks, and sometimes even months without adequate nutrition. So the body is constantly responding to those sets of signals that occur on the outside world. The cells in the body have to respond to that, and they do it because we have two basic signaling systems within the body that tell the individual cells what's required of them right now. One of those systems is the electrical system. It's basically, when we think about it, it's what the central nervous system runs on, a set of electrical impulses that travel through the nervous system, both coming from the outlying areas of the body, the skin, the muscle, to the central nervous system, to the brain, through the spinal cord, typically. And then ultimately it turns right around and sends signals back out so that the body knows what to do. Now, the nice thing about the electrical system is that it's very, very fast. So if I inadvertently pick up a hot pan or pot, I can drop it immediately because the electrical system is so fast, and it tells me my brain recognizes the fact that something is terribly, and I can send signals back out to the muscles in my hand saying, release the pot and let it go. There are other types of messages and things that are occurring that can take place on a much slower basis. And that's really where the endocrine biochemical system comes into play. There is a messaging system, all based on biochemistry, and run primarily by messenger type molecules. There are a whole variety of different messenger molecules. Some of them we recognize and call hormones, and there are projected at this point to be some in excess of some 200 different hormones in the body that are operating all the time, sending out messages. Sometimes, in the case of epinephrine and norepinephrine, the flight or fight response hormones, they operate pretty quickly, and they have very direct chemical pathways. Other hormones are much slower in their operation, so that when I eat, for example, my body creates hormones in response to the amount of food that I've eaten, and they will send signals from my stomach up to my brain saying, I think you've had enough now, stop eating. I don't need to respond to that in milliseconds. I can respond to that in 5 and 20 minutes, and I'm just fine. So the body has these two different signaling systems. And basically what happens in exposure to toxins, synthetic chemicals, is that under normal circumstances, it is an incredibly finely tuned symphony where we have all these different messages being sent, chemicals that the body creates, maybe brings some of them in from the outside through the food supply, and we coordinate and organize all those messages. And because we evolved over many, many millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, perhaps even going back billions of years, we know what to do with all those different messages, and they balance each other in perfect harmony, and they're able to maintain what's called homeostasis, our ability to survive in a changing environment. When we get exposed to synthetic chemicals, the synthetic chemicals interrupt that whole communication system. The normal functioning starts to get disrupted. The clear-cut signals that we rely upon for quick responses, for accurate responses, start to become muddied and muddled. The endocrine system, for example, relies upon a whole series of steps in the communications sequence. Number one, a hormone, or what is technically called a ligand, a signaling molecule, has to be created, and it has to be created accurately because it has a very, very specific shape. It has a very, very specific set of charges that are distributed around that shape. That ligand has to be pushed out into general circulation. Typically, if it's an endocrine hormone, for example, some hormones, by the way, will interact in just their immediate neighborhood. They are typically called paracrine hormones. They talk to the cells that are right around them. But the endocrine system is perhaps the gland is located in the head, and it creates these hormones that are then entered into general circulation. They are distributed through the entire body, and they speak to cells everywhere. When that's the case, the ligand, the hormone itself, has to be created in a very, very specific fashion. It sometimes travels freely through the circulation, or sometimes has to be carried through the circulation in a very specific um, protein casing, because it may be that that particular hormone, and some are not, are either water soluble or lipid or fat soluble. Fat soluble hormones don't travel in the water-based system of general circulation, and so they need to be encapsulated by some sort of a protein that is itself water soluble and can travel through the bloodstream, but it, in a sense, hides the fat soluble aspect, chemical aspect of the hormone until it's delivered to the target. Now it travels through the general circulation and ultimately arrives at a destination. How does it know that? Well, there is a receptor, a little antenna that sticks out of the cell membrane at the far end of this communication system. It recognizes the ligand, and this is a very, very complex, complicated sort of process. It's often been talked about as a lock and key type of mechanism, where the receptor is the lock, and it's basically looking for an exact match key. When that happens, then the receptor is activated, and a signal is sent down into the cell, and action and activity takes place. As you can imagine, when I start filling up my system with all these toxins, chemical toxins, the problem comes in that many of them look very, very much like the natural hormones and the natural signaling agents within the body. Suddenly, I can have a variety of problems that ensue as a result of that. Number one, my normal level of hormone may be at a certain spot. Suddenly, I'm getting all these additional chemicals into my body that look like that hormone, and suddenly it seems like I'm upregulating the hormone. And consequently, the receptors on cells throughout my body are being overstimulated, and they're being asked to inappropriately do things that they're not really supposed to be doing at that moment. It may also be that instead of amplifying the effect of the hormone, that perhaps in fact, in some instances, those synthetic chemicals will bind to the receptors much more readily than will the actual hormones themselves. And so instead of, and because they're not exact matches, they don't provide the exact message that should take place. And so the receptor, in a sense, is inactivated because it doesn't get the exact right signal. And so the synthetic chemical can act as a hormone blocker. And so you can't get proper functioning of the system because suddenly all of the receptors are occupied by chemicals that don't really send the right message. Now, if that's a critical message at a given point in time, then I can be in a lot of trouble health-wise. Very, very frequently what happens is it's a percentage of the signal. They don't occupy all of the receptors, but if a third or half of the receptors are inappropriately occupied and rendered inoperable, then only a small percentage of the actual message is getting through by the normal hormones. That can create all kinds of downstream problems as well. So we have problems with these synthetic chemicals disrupting what should be a very, very precise, very, very well synchronized set of signals throughout the body so that the body knows what to do. That's what's taking place on a cellular level. As that extends and takes place over time, then the effects compound, and they start to create all sorts of changes taking place on a cellular basis. The types of problems that we see resulting from that, of course, can be developmental changes where receptors or hormones themselves that should develop in a certain way at a certain critical point in development don't happen because the proper signals are never sent. They're either never sent or they're never received adequately and appropriately. So we can have those kinds of problems take place. We can have different types of cancer develop because the environment of the cell is disrupted in a very significant way. And there is a theory that cancer, in many ways and in most instances, is an environmental problem. An environment not only meaning the outside world and all the synthetic toxins we get exposed to, but it's the environment of the cell itself, that no longer is the cell able to adequately regulate itself and to provide for all of its needs because the signaling system is broken down. And so consequently, the cell starts scrambling and trying to figure out ways of getting around this. How can it survive? What can it do? And it starts to then inappropriately develop all kinds of DNA-based responses that ultimately evolve into a cancer state. So we see things, these chemicals creating neurotoxic types of problems where the cell signaling through the central nervous system is disrupted. Serotonin, GABA, a variety of different neurotransmitters no longer transmit as they should and as they're initially designed. Again, because of all of this disruption that's taking place, a lot of the endocrine disrupting chemicals confuse and disrupt the normal biochemical signaling and messaging system in the body. It can't function properly. We get these inappropriate programs life. And again, we see the development of cancers as a result of inappropriate environmental responses on a cellular basis to the inputs taking place around them. So the bottom line, of course, is that we have a body that is designed to function pretty close to perfectly in a natural setting where there are no synthetic chemicals getting in the way of the natural communication system. We operate much better when we have a more pure, clean version of ourselves operating. What do we do in order to, in a sense, return to that type of environment and get to a point where our bodies can operate properly? And unfortunately, the answer to that in many ways is that we need to avoid contact with as many of these chemicals as we possibly can. Now, that's not about to happen, in fact, because we all live in the 21st century. There's simply no way that as a society or a civilization, we can turn the hands of the clock back 500 years, if that would be enough, and all live that way. We have chemicals and systems and all sorts of things put in place that maintain life the way we have all come to accept it and adapt to it. But a lot of us have individual choices where we can at least minimize our exposure to many of these chemicals. And really the major ways of doing that are, number one, eating a diet that's largely organic and avoiding a lot of the chemical exposures that we get through the food supply system. Number two, we talked a little bit in one of these sessions about a nifty little tool from the Environmental Working Group called Healthy Living. It's a phone app. It is available free for iPhones and Android phones. You can download it. You can scan the personal care items, sunscreens, food items that you might buy. And because neither you nor I are chemists, fortunately, the chemists at the Environmental Working Group have gone ahead and evaluated these products and said, and rated them all, basically telling you that the chemicals in these products are safe, or the chemicals in other products are simply not safe, and you're better off avoiding them. And the fortunate thing is there are good alternatives for virtually all of these things. So there are lots of things that we can do individually to clean up our environment. None of us are going to be able to make it 100% pure, 100% clean. That just isn't going to happen. But we can certainly vastly improve the environment that we live in and our chances for living safely in an unsafe world. I hope to see you Thursday morning at 8:30. We'll talk about houseplants and some of the other things we can do to improve our immediate environments and live more successfully. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. Good evening.